Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in this segment, we're going to discuss a study that's been released by the University of Cambridge's new Center for the Future of Democracy, which has found that young people around the world are more disillusioned with democracy right now than at any generation in living memory. Now, we're talking about, of course, a time when we have populist leaders around the world, right? And we talk a lot about right-wing populist leaders, but even left-wing populist leaders are just as important to discuss, certainly. And in this survey and study, it's found that, in fact, populism is the one saving grace, if we may call it that, when it comes to democracy in the eyes of the world's youth, that populist leaders sort of, are helping democracy along. Will that be enough? Because, on the right side, at least, of populism, we can see that there's a lot of hatred coming out towards minorities, immigrants, etc., and people of different ethnic groups as well. Obviously, the obvious factors here are ones that we can probably guess, such as unemployment, economic issues, especially, I would imagine, as we're talking right now, as the world is going through this pandemic, which in many places is now within its second wave as well, and the wealth inequality that is bringing up to the fore, especially in developed democracies around the world. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're joined now by Dr. Roslyn Fuller, who is the author of In Defense of Democracy. She's also director of the Solonian Democracy Institute. She's joining us today from Dublin. Joining us this morning from Orlando, Florida, is Dr. Maria Puerta Riera, who is an adjunct professor of political science and sociology at Valencia College and Ana G. Mendez University. And joining us from Cambridge is Dr. Sir Richard Evans, who is a historian. He is Regius Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Cambridge. Richard, Maria, and Roslyn, thank you to all three of you for your time today. Roslyn, let me start with you. What do you make of this study? I would imagine it's not very surprising to say that democracy right now, as we probably understand it, isn't as appealing to the youth.
Yes, well, I think it's important to emphasize, as this study did itself, that what the question mainly concerned was how satisfied people were with how democracy is performing. And that's a very different question than saying, do you think we should quit democracy as a system?
Of course,
or do you think that there are other things that are better than democracy? So there was actually a Pew Research study done a few years ago that showed that around the world, it was also a global study, there was still very, very high levels of approval for either representative or direct democracy as systems of government. So it's important to remember that. At the same time, of course, as the study has highlighted, there are a lot of grievances that younger people have, whether it be housing prices or job inequality, that are causing them to be dissatisfied with current politicians, but also just to become a little bit disillusioned with the entire democratic process. We do see that when there are candidates that appeal to those issues, for example, Jeremy Corbyn or Bernie Sanders in the United States, that we do see young people coming out and involving themselves a lot in those issues. We see that in, for example, referendums in Ireland. We've had referendums on abortion. We've had referendums on a referendum on gay marriage. We saw a lot of people coming out and involving themselves in those issues. So when there's something that does appeal to them, young people are still engaging in large numbers.
Indeed. And Maria, where you're sitting right now, the U.S. elections are very quickly coming up, right? So what are your thoughts about this study? Because it's quite pertinent, isn't it? Where I would imagine that at some level, in fact, the opposite effect may be happening right now in the U.S., or maybe not. What do you think?
Well, this study is not the only one who recognizes that there has been a sort of hopelessness with respect to democracy. But I wouldn't say it's about its values and principles as much as it is about its capability of delivering goods. I think that's the problem. And here in the U.S., you can see it. Some other studies like Varieties of Democracy, which I am familiar with, they have found that American democracy has also been failing in terms of acceptance. And young people find it very hard, not just to make a living. You were mentioning at the beginning, unemployment, housing. We're talking about social mobility. Going to college doesn't guarantee that you will, rise up to following social, well-being or just imagine how hard it is in this country for a young man who is out of college with a huge student debt. So that hurts all your possibilities to afford housing, for example. Even, the basics. Buying a car, credit here is very important. And if you have student loans, that is really hurting your possibilities. So yes, there is dissatisfaction, but there's hopelessness. People are hopeless that democracy can, in fact, deliver.
All right. So what are your thoughts from your vantage point as a historian? I mean, we're talking about wealth inequality here, unemployment. There's a lot to discuss there about the failures and the legitimate grievances on the part of the youth vis-a-vis developed countries' democracy. So we can talk, of course, about the UK, and we've just had. And we're going through the Brexit process, the trade talks, et cetera, the very contentious talks. What are your thoughts about all that?
Well, I said, although I am at Cambridge, it's not my study. I was not involved in this study. What it found was that 55% of global millennials, that's people born between 1980 and 2000, were dissatisfied with democracy. And that, I think, I agree with Maria, that is a democracy in principle. But that's not really connected with the rise of populism, which has an appeal much more to older groups, I think, in many countries. Populism is not a help to democracy. Populism is anti-democratic. These are politicians who say that democratic institutions are simply ways of reproducing elites, and they speak for the people. So a classic example of this is the referendum, which is not a particularly democratic institution. Referendums tend, as Mr. Thatcher said many years ago, tend to be the instrument of dictators and demagogues right across the world. It depends on how you frame the question. So that the Brexit process bypassed the institutions of democracy, such as Parliament and general elections, and it was ended up in a vote for Brexit of 37%, just over a third of the electorate. And it was immediately claimed by populist leaders to be a vote by the British people. The populists identify with the people. They say they are the people, and those who disagree are not the people. So I think that is a very dangerous development, and it's something that doesn't align exactly with the fact of younger people being dissatisfied with democracy. Younger people in Britain are overwhelmingly in favour of remaining in the EU, and one reason for the dissatisfaction is the fact that Britain has left.
So then, how does one overcome this, right? We have populist leaders, and whether we like it or not, they are, as the word essentially alludes to, they are popular, at least within their base, and they have a very strong support base. So if we're talking about Boris Johnson, Donald Trump, Viktor Orban, et cetera, they all have a very strong support. So how does one then come to terms with both democracy and populism?
I think this is a very interesting question, and it's really going to the heart of the matter, because in trying to define this distinction between democracy and populism, one's end up in a very self-contradictory mode of argument. Democracy is, at the end of the day, and this has been a trope for a long time, it's always been said to be a popularity contest where people are competing to get the votes of other people. You're competing to get their approval. So this idea that there is a conflict between democracy and populism, and that referendums are not democratic, or that movements like the Five Star Movement, which allow all of their members to vote on many issues, and things like coalition agreements, are undemocratic, is, I think, a very fundamentally false one. So by blocking this so-called populism from flowing into the democratic process, of course, you're coming into a situation where more and more people are simply falling out of that process and don't feel that their voices are being heard. As we have agreed, in democratic societies, we have agreed that every person gets one vote. So you can't say that just because you don't like how someone's voted, that person is now what is called a populist. And I agree, those take many forms. Some populists are right-wing racist xenophobes. But some people who have been called populists definitely aren't and haven't done anything to deserve that label, yet they're being lumped in the same category. So I think this is part of what's driving the problem, is this attempt to limit the meaning of democracy to something that some people are comfortable with.
Yeah, we just have under 2 minutes, so I'm going to go to you first, Richard, and just under a minute if you can. I wanted you to respond to Roslyn there, because democracy versus populism, how do you see that?
Well, democracy, of course, can be left-wing. Look at Maduro, for example, or look at Venezuela. There are left-wing demagogues, left-wing populists as well as right-wing ones. Populism has resulted in a number of regimes which despise science because they think of scientists as part of the elite who they're against. Populist leaders have been catastrophically bad in preserving the health of their population in the face of the current pandemic. And it's not surprising that the Cambridge survey has found that once populists get into government, they tend to lose popularity. And that's why they grasp, like Viktor Orban, for example, in Hungary, for anti-democratic means of suppressing opposition, coordinating the media, and in general staying in power by undemocratic means. And that's a reason, I think, why we should be very, very concerned about the spread of populism across the world.
And Marie, the final word, just under a minute. You know, you're again in the U.S. Donald Trump, arguably, of course, a populist leader. He still very much, though, has the support, doesn't he?
Does have support, but within his own base. The problem for him has been that he hasn't grown out of his base. He has fed his base with his own policy decisions and his own rhetoric. But he has, in fact, because of that same interest in keeping his coalition together, young, no college white males. He has lost women, for example, which was a very important part of the electorate. And he has, in fact, there are signs that those senior electors above 65 are also not in droves, but they are, taking some distance from his lately. Okay. They have taken distance from his political behavior, I would say. Yes, definitely.
Very well. There's a final word, but we appreciate all three of our guests for their time today and for speaking to us, regardless of their busy schedules. That was Roslyn, who was speaking to us from Dublin, Maria, who was speaking to us from Orlando, and Richard, who was speaking to us from Cambridge. They're sharing their expertise on this study by the University of Cambridge's Center for Future of Democracy, speaking about this disillusionment with democracy in being able to resolve the issues that it has claimed that it can resolve, such as inequality, and of course a whole host of other issues that we can probably list. That doesn't mean that democracy in and of itself is bad. It just means that the way it's played out in many places around the world, especially also in these developed democracies, most importantly, which are always held up as moral examples for the rest of us around the world, that it hasn't actually lived up to all the promises. That especially at this time of the pandemic, we can see wealth inequality ever more clearly in front of our eyes, even in those countries at this point. Unemployment, et cetera, et cetera. That's why we then have the rise of these populist leaders that have been rising for a while now. So Five-Star Movement in Italy, Viktor Orban in Hungary, Donald Trump in the US, Boris Johnson in the UK. I mean, the list is really quite endless. Is it as simple as saying that democracy and populism are two competing opposite ideologies that cannot coexist? Doesn't one sort of lead to the other and